Spoiler alert, America is not being invaded here, people. Okay? So if your entire legal case rests on the idea that America is being invaded, then you are asking lots of people in the federal government to lie.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller. Delighted to have back staff writer at The New Yorker, which writes a weekly column on life in Washington. She's the co-author of The Divider, Trump in the White House, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker, former Moscow bureau chief for The Washington Post. It's Susan Glasser. What's up, Susan?
Hey, Tim. Great to be with you.
Much to discuss. You're back from Estonia, I understand.
That is right. You know, got to go to Tallinn. It's an awesome place. Seriously, I'm actually like a huge Estonia super fan.
Jeb was a huge Estonia super fan, and Tallinn's been on my list. I don't think it's going to happen for me on my vacation this summer, but hopefully next time you're at a panel, invited to a panel, maybe you can nominate me as a co-panelist. I understand you're with the presidents of Estonia, Slovenia, and Finland. So I'm curious,
it was.
What was the buzz there? Like, which one of those presidents do you like the most?
Well, it was a kind of an intimidating group, I have to say. It was the closing panel, and I guess they decided this was the best they could do for American representation. But, it's very interesting because Alex Stubb is the president of Finland, and you may not know this. I forgive you, European president trivia, but he was a star golf player back in the day. And so his fellow Europeans, he's also a super brilliant actually academic turned politician. So his fellow Europeans thought it would be a really good idea to make him their designated Trump whisperer. Okay, and they sent him to Mar-a-Lago to play golf with the president. He spent 7 hours doing that, and he has become a big proponent of the engage Trump wherever possible school of European diplomacy. So it was very interesting to hear what he had to say. And I think the basic point is they need to be in Trump's ear more, because there are a lot of people who are definitely not on the same page when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Europe and lots of other issues.
Maybe just move to Palm Beach. Can you run Finland from South Florida?
Well,
and just
it would
become
definitely
a Mar-a-Lago
be warmer.
member?
It would definitely be a lot warmer. But he was also then on the phone call the very next day after our panel with European leaders and Trump after Trump's phone call with Vladimir Putin. And I don't think things went quite so well for the Europeans in that call.
Is the tone there, even off panel, like when you're talking to folks, just like we've got to start to plan for no America, or is it more, we can butter this guy up and buy his cryptocurrency and make it work, or we'll just ride the bumpy waves? Like, what's the mindset among the kind of Eastern European crowd?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a group of people whose security depends not just on the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but on, Trump not completely blowing up NATO, on what happens after the Ukraine war. You can't go to Estonia and not be aware of the vulnerability of these small countries who we accepted into NATO a couple decades ago. And, I think this was the West is over kind of crowd, a sense that it's not just a question of waiting a few more years for the U.S. to snap back. It's really a very post-American conversation in many ways now, except I will say this. I still feel that in their heart of hearts, they can't fully accept this. And, so there will continue to be, you've seen this phenomenon in the Republican Party. It's not dissimilar to the phenomenon among our European allies and partners, because there's no obvious and easy solutions that don't involve the United States when it comes to how to confront Russia. And so, there's a sort of a despair, but they keep, the hope stays alive for these folks. Okay, well, maybe he's going to consider the sanctions. They've assured us that he's not going to blow up NATO. They actually did have Trump's NATO ambassador come to this conference, which was interesting, Matt Whitaker, that he chose to show up. But the flip side was the hopefulness. It's dashed the very next day. Right? On Monday, all of a sudden, wait a minute, America isn't on board with sanctions, even when Putin doesn't choose to go along with us. And so from my perspective, the rhetoric I'm hearing is tougher than in Trump's first term from the Europeans, right? Like they claim that they're more reality based, but the vibe is still a bit of denial. They can't really believe it.
I forgot that middling Iowa football star Matt Whitaker was our NATO ambassador. That was a fact I knew and talked about on the podcast, but just, you only have so much room in your brain for all these characters. And so that's interesting that he was there. Did you talk to him when he was there?
I did not, but I saw him bustling around importantly multiple times. He definitely had the most kind of middle America football vibe of anyone who was attending this security conference in Tallinn. I think I did talk to a lot of senior Europeans who feel that maybe they can avoid being at the center of Trump's attention, because that's usually not a good thing. No. But that's a kind of a best case scenario for them. And, in some ways, there might be some relief if he moves on from his idea that he's going to make a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, because I think they're so worried about what the terms of that would be.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice transition into that. So you mentioned that call. So we talked yesterday with David French about the Trump-Putin call, which was 2 hours apparently, and the readouts of which were quite different. A very Russian reserved, calculated readout from the Putin side, a braggadocious readout from the Trump side, and then, as you mentioned, there's then this follow-up call with the European stakeholders, and reports from the FT are pretty bleak about that call. Two people briefed on the call said Trump was clear he'd pulled the U.S. back from engaging with the conflict and leave Ukraine and Russia to directly negotiate a ceasefire. He made no promise of future U.S. sanctions against Russia. They added a different person familiar with the conversation said Trump was not ready to put greater pressure on Putin. Shocking. So, what do you make about kind of that fallout?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example, is that where Trumpology, if you will, often fails is because people who have a lot riding on the outcome of Trump will listen to the word of his staff or his enablers rather than, kind of looking at, well, where's Trump himself at? And, on the Ukraine, it's just been very clear for a very long time that Trump is not on the same team as the Europeans. And so I understand diplomacy has to occur no matter what and seek to find space even where it doesn't exist. And so that's why as journalists are probably not well suited to that occupation, because it requires to a certain extent the willful suspension of disbelief. But when it comes to Putin and Trump, we've got 8 years of a record here that suggests that Trump is looking to reset U.S. ties with Russia, and that is the goal that's stymied. The war in Ukraine, that's secondary to that bigger goal of a U.S.-Russia reset that I think Trump has been pursuing since he entered political life. And I was really struck. There was a quote at the very bottom of the Washington Post write-up of this Putin-Trump call that I think really summed it up. And it was from Konstantin Kosachev, who is the head of the Foreign Affairs Council and the committee in the Federation Council in the Russian parliament. And he basically said, yeah, it's clear from this call, there are two sides in these negotiations. There's a U.S.-Russia side and a Ukraine-European side. And, first of all, that's a gut punch of a quote. But second of all, it's hard to take issue with that. I think that's accurate at the moment.
Yeah, sure. And even to the extent that, that the Trump administration, maybe not Trump himself, are trying to kind of paper over that reality and, at times talk about how, Russia needs to step up and come to the table and it's time for them to do so. And, and leaving the door open, as you mentioned, some staff leaving the door open to sanctions. Like the general contours of this have been pretty clear for a while. And I mean, you talked about the Trumpology of it, like the Kremlinology of it is pretty clear, right? Like Putin's statements are all so qualified. Like with the beginnings of a deal, we're looking into the outlines of an agreement, and there's more negotiation to come. Like meanwhile, stepping up the bombing, it's pretty clear that that Putin sees this as these guys don't have the stomach for this, even if they were on the Ukraine-Europe side. They're not going to stick around. If I can just keep stalling and, for time, eventually they're going to do what they might be doing imminently, which is just walking away from this altogether.
Yeah, Tim, I agree with your reading of the situation. If anything, I would say it's even more embarrassing for the Trump administration than that, because Putin has already succeeded in getting Trump to abandon the goal that he outlined from the beginning. Trump said that he was demanding an immediate ceasefire that would then be followed by longer-term peace talks. Okay, that was the precondition. He's now given that up. He basically handed that to Vladimir Putin, who had to concede nothing in order to get that. So Trump's entire performative, metaphorically beating the crap out of Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office was all designed to get Zelensky to go along with his kind of extortionate minerals deal, but also with this demand for a 30-day ceasefire on the front end with no other conditions imposed on Russia. Now, Zelensky went along with that, and Putin said, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. And Trump, rather than saying, okay, well, there are costs to you for not agreeing to this, said, okay. So he's abandoned the entire negotiating position that the U.S. was setting up over the last 3 months. I mean, it's a really interesting example of Donald Trump and his alleged deal-making prowess. The people who studied closely what Trump has done in the diplomatic arena as president in his first term and so far in his second term, he's not a very good deal maker.
No, to say the least. So broadening it out from what's happening in this negotiation to what we saw in the Middle East last week, Trump offers this, what his enablers and like kind of the fancy MAGA foreign policy types around him want to fashion into some doctrine with his speech in Saudi Arabia. That I played the audio yesterday of Marco Rubio talking about how this is the most important foreign policy speech since the Brandenburg Gate or whatever. And you offered this explanation for the Trump doctrine, which I'd like for you to expand on, which I think is basically right. Trump's foreign policy doctrine is not a doctrine at all, but a way of life defined by extreme transactionalism and self-interest. And that's really what it comes down to in both the Europe situation and what we saw in the Middle East. And so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why actually Trump going to the Middle East for his first extended foreign policy trip of both his first term and his second term is really the tell here. Donald Trump wants to sort of be in the bazaar, and he's kind of value neutral about what's going to happen in the bazaar, except that, good things should happen for him and his interests. And that's largely defined as in a very personal sense. So, Qatar giving me a plane and Qatar giving my son a business deal to build a new real estate development with my name slapped across the top. UAE, Saudi Arabia, these are all almost the personalization of American foreign policy. And that's why he's so comfortable, I think, in that milieu. By the way, to the point about Secretary Marco Rubio and the difference between him and Senator Marco Rubio, I saw that quote about Rubio claiming that Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia was, the most important thing, which is a really remarkable thing to say because it was essentially plagiarized from Trump's own speech in Saudi Arabia 8 years ago when he said the exact same thing to the Saudis. He literally went to Saudi Arabia. And, I have to say, even Trump's critics suffer from a very routine cases of amnesia. And I recognize we have a lot of inputs here. It's hard to keep it straight, but a little bit more focused, people, on the history of what's already occurred with Donald Trump would be very useful in not getting, sort of taken advantage of and spun over and over and over again. Donald Trump went to Saudi Arabia 8 years ago, and the orb gave a speech in which he said, America will no longer lecture to you, and we won't give you annoying rants about human rights and things like that. And we're here to do business. And by the way, I'm going to announce an unprecedented number of business deals, which flash forward never materialized in the course of his 4 years in office.
Well, the golf league came. We got the rival golf league. So we
that actually, I believe, was after. That was during his right. He talked about it in his presidency, but I think it only came to be in his post-presidency or his interregnum between presidencies. And he went last week, and what did he say? We're not here to lecture you, and here's this unprecedented number of business deals that very likely will not fully materialize.
A very good note, Susan. This is why we're bringing you here for your. It's horrific that we have to be like, you're a Trump historian.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew you were going to say that. You're a Trump historian, and I have to say,
I'm usually playing the Trump historian role, but this is an important job for you as well. Unfortunately, so here we are,
Tim. I remember, literally, you're giving me nightmares because I remember back when Trump first started to run for office and when it was clear that he was very likely going to get the Republican nomination and actually, be a serious candidate. And I was the editor of Politico and at the time, and I said, I was kind of like joking in a way. It started off as a jokey riff about Trumpology and how we're going to need to have it. And I was imagining the sort of like future Department of Trump studies and, the universities. And I sort of went off on this riff with my colleagues, my good friend, Blake Hounshell, who was my fellow editor at Politico, and Michael Cruz, who's an excellent writer who's still there. And we decided, okay, we're actually going to convene the leading, at that time, Trumpologists, people who'd already written biographies of Trump. They'd never met each other, it turned out. And I invited them to Trump Tower, to that really not very good restaurant in the basement, the Trump Grill.
Bowl? I think. Did you have a taco bowl?
It was like a sort of really like a not so great chicken Caesar salad, I think, is what I ate. But we had these 5 biographers of Donald Trump meet each other for the first time. And had this session that we called the Trumpologist. And I thought it was very insightful, actually. I learned a lot about that. But of course, at the time, I didn't really think there would be future departments of Trump studies. And I certainly did not think that 8 years later or 9 years later, I would be labeled a Trump historian. But I think that's where we are.
You would be the one. We'll have to go back to Trump Tower, bring Maggie, Tim O'Brien, our little coterie. Actually, just really quick on Marco, we had moved on, but it's worth saying, in addition to it being repetitive of his Saudi Arabia speech 8 years ago, it also is a direct rebuke of everything Marco Rubio ever stood for and ran for president on. And it is worth noting, at least, say what you want about J.D. Vance. I have a lot negative to say. But he at least has provided kind of some kind of pro forma rationale for his pivot, right? He has offered an explanation. It's not particularly satisfying, but at least some explanation for why he went from saying Trump could be Hitler to wanting to be his VP. That's never really happened for Marco. And it's a little bit on the domestic stuff, but this foreign policy switch from, I believe in American values throughout the world. I believe we should be welcoming people fleeing communism. That whole, kind of great American century, whatever it was called, that Marco was pushing in 2016. I don't feel like I've gotten a satisfactory answer for him for why now he is we just want peace and happiness and transactionalism and kleptocracy. And I think that's the right way for the world to work. Do you feel that way?
Well, I take your point, Tim, and I would just venture that perhaps you haven't gotten a satisfactory answer from Marco Rubio because he doesn't have one. Okay. Maybe he doesn't agree. Right. For example, on the Russia thing, he gave a long testimony yesterday on Capitol Hill, and he was asked about the Putin-Trump call.
Yeah.
And, he did that classic, what I think of as the sort of GOP establishment two-step. Mm-hmm. And, that they always think they're being really clever. And he said, well, the sanctions that the U.S. had on Russia when I woke up this morning are exactly the same as they were before the phone call. So we haven't backed off anything. And I've been watching that dance for a long time. It's just that Marco Rubio has parlayed that dance into Secretary of State
I want to put a finer point on the Trump doctrine, just about kind of the shallowness of it. And we have like this, as you described it, extreme transactionalism. Like, doesn't always work, right? Like, Putin's not really interested in a golf resort deal, with Trump. Like, he has other historical and ideological and other things that he's thinking about. To that point, there's a news item from CNN this morning that says that the U.S. has obtained new intelligence suggesting that Israel is making preparations to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, even as the Trump administration has been pursuing a diplomatic deal with Tehran, according to multiple U.S. officials familiar with the latest intelligence. Like, we'll see what happens with this. But again, like it just betrays the limits of the transactionalism. Like, there are much deeper wounds and ambitions and disagreements with regards to Iran and Israel, or Russia and Ukraine, that cannot be salvaged by like meeting at a golf course and being like, hey, we're going to divide up the spoils, like we do with the Qatari, emir, right? Like that, like there is things, geopolitics is more complicated than that. And so I'm just wondering how you think the so-called Trump doctrine intersects with potentially what we're seeing with Israel and Iran, and or take that any way you wish.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, because in both the case of Netanyahu and Putin, right, they actually have a view of what their own national security long-term requires that is very different than Donald Trump's definition of himself and the state as the overriding factor. Now, Netanyahu clearly has at times prioritized his own personal political survival. Sure. You can have any number of people on your show to talk about that, and how, Netanyahu has really distorted the politics of Israel and undermined arguably the security of Israel by prioritizing his own personal political troubles at various points. However, and it's a big however, Israelis across the political spectrum see the Iran threat in a very existential way that's very different than how it's viewed in Washington by someone like Donald Trump. And so I think that's important to underscore. That same thing with Putin. Trump thinks, well, I could just make him just, a whole array of concessions and then he'll do what I want, because in the end, he doesn't really want this war, except
he just wants money.
His whole theory of the case when it comes to Russia and the war in Ukraine is completely flawed. The original mistake in it is thinking that Putin doesn't want the war, but in fact, it's Putin's war. So the idea that that's the overriding goal for him, Putin's goal is to win the war, not to have war not happen in and of itself. And he has accomplished many of the goals of his presidency through the use of war. Putin came to power 25 years ago by waging a war in Chechnya. He doesn't have a long record of ending wars with peace talks. He has a long record of remilitarizing Russian society in ways that aggrandize his own role and the role of the state. He has potential domestic political problems were he to end the war and then be accountable for all the deaths, especially if he didn't achieve the stated goals of the war. And he's also defined the war in very existential terms. If you say that Ukraine doesn't exist as a real state, that it's an illegitimate state, it's very hard to just go ahead and be like, oh, but actually Donald Trump asked so nicely.
Right. Although you also hit on a key point with it's related to this with the Trumpology, about Trump misunderstanding the Putin rationale for the war. Trump really misunderstands a lot of these players in a lot of this case, because back to the Trumpology, to those authors that you brought back together, what is Trump's framework of the world? Right? He wants money, he wants fame, he wants riches and women for himself, right? Like, that's just like Trump's a pretty simple animal, like a pretty simple creature, right? But he has all of those desires and like the extreme, right? Like the megalomaniacal version of all of that, right? And so he looks at all these other people and he's like, well, Putin and And Putin just wants to be able to make more money, like, and get back into, just like me, and be the peacemaker. He got new land, and he just wants fame and money, or in the Ayatollah in Iran, they just want to be able to cut a deal where they can, we can reopen with them, and they can get oil, and Bibi, and then they just want condos in Gaza, right? And it is impossible for him to process the idea that they might have religious, ideological concerns for their for the interests of their nation state, because he doesn't relate to any of that. He doesn't have any religious belief or deep ideological belief, right? And so I do think that is the fundamental flaw of all this, that eventually gets exposed, and why it's more appealing to him to deal with MBS is kind of more like him in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful theory of the case. What you're describing, Tim, is I think the political scientists call it mirroring. That's the big problem in, foreign policy, is that you mirror and you think that what matters to you is what matters the most to your interlocutor. And, Trump, he doesn't know history. He doesn't know context. He doesn't really care. He does have a long-term theory of the case when it comes to the world. And you can go back. I always recommend to people to read this 1989 interview that he conducted with Playboy magazine. It's almost a sort of Rosetta Stone of Donald Trump's international views. And it won't surprise you to know he thinks that America, even back then, was getting ripped off by its allies, that everybody was out to get us. At that time, it was Japan, not China, that he felt had an advantage in the world economic system. He was praising strong leaders and bemoaning weak leaders of other countries at that time. He even thought that the Chinese had done exactly the right thing in Tiananmen Square by cracking down and killing their own people to end protest. And he contrasted that very favorably with the weakness of Gorbachev, who was leading to the Soviet Union's breakup. And, so in a way, he told us everything we need to know about him as an international actor, back when the Cold War was still the Cold War.
You can see the weaknesses of how all that ended up playing out, based on his worldview as well. Just one last thing on this is in your article, I forget if your last one or the previous, and how you went to visit Mar-a-Lago. And he had the model of his desired Air Force One, on the what were you on the veranda? And it was on an outside table. Where were you?
No, it was the inside lobby of Mar-a-Lago in the spring of 2021, and we went there for a book interview. And it was just vintage Trump, of course, wanting to have an interview in essentially a public space so that everyone in the club could come through and see that he was there meeting with important people. And, literally, I didn't put this in the column the other day, but the detail that always struck me is we walk in there, and this was in late April of 2021. And it's just essentially Trump sitting on the couch in the lobby. There are a couple of armchairs. There's a coffee table. The only thing on the coffee table is this model of Air Force One with the navy red and white colors he wanted to have on it. Right next to this little seating arrangement, there's one of those big easels and a poster board, and it says, "Sign up for your Mother's Day brunch now." And we sit there, and Kimberly Guilfoyle is walking through in the middle of this interview. Just amazing. But so we saw the Air Force One model, and that was the very first thing that I mentioned to him in the interview is, why did he bring that with him? And, did he think it would still come to pass even though he was out of office?
What does Mar-a-Lago smell like? I'm never going to get to go to Mar-a-Lago, so it's fascinating to me a little bit.
First of all, never say never. I did not think that Donald Trump was going to want me to come to Mar-a-Lago either. And I remember saying to Peter, my husband and co-author, are you sure that they know that I'm coming to this interview? But
did you feel a chill walking in, or that you kind of had crossed into the nether parts of the world?
It was very interesting. Remember that in the spring of 2021, Donald Trump was still very much in exile. It was not a foregone conclusion that he was going to come back and be president again. And, he was very isolated at that time. He didn't have a big staff. He didn't have, all the fawning kind of Republican members of Congress really around him anymore. So it was just him and the paying guests. So he was eager to talk to anybody at that particular moment in time. I refer to this as his Napoleon and Elba period.
Yeah, sure. You didn't answer this about the smell, though.
It didn't have any particular smell that I recall. Maybe the whiff of money.
Because I think either kind of dank, because it's been around for so long, kind of dank,
it wasn't
old hotel
dank.
smell, or like kind of cougar perfume smell is so intense that it overtakes everything, but neither of those.
I feel like, maybe the latter, definitely not the former. It wasn't dank in any way. There were a lot of portraits of Donald Trump, including, by the way, in the ladies' bathroom.
Susan.
Right? I know. Isn't this a terrible thing? We did stay for dinner at his insistence and watch the scene on the terrace as all the people stood and applaud him as he came up to dinner. The food was decent. The food was decent.
I apologize for that.
I have to say, it was pretty good.
We're cutting that. We're not acknowledging any positive traits about Mar-a-Lago on this podcast.
I'm being honest. I'm just being honest.
I appreciate
Don't censor
your candor. That is the spirit of this podcast, is radical candor, even if it means complimenting the fucking food at Mar-a-Lago. I'm trying to divine the Kremlinology of what's going on in Washington these days. Is something we're all working on. So I got Susan Glasser on the podcast today. If you're looking for other folks who have their finger on the pulse, NPR Politics Podcast is a place that I go to decode what's happening over on the Hill and what every decision out there might mean for me and you. Every day, the NPR Politics Podcast team focuses on just one thing and boils it down to just 15 minutes or less. You can think of it as your political multivitamin. Obviously, I'm having more of a freewheeling conversation over here, trying to get into people's feelings. And, you don't always got time for that. I mean, I always got time for it. But when you're consuming other people's information, sometimes I like to have an alternative that's like, tight. Give me what I need. Just the facts, ma'am. And the NPR Politics team does a great job for that. You can listen now to the NPR Politics Podcast, only from NPR, wherever you get podcasts.
Do you ever look at political headlines and go, huh? Well, that's exactly why the NPR Politics Podcast exists. We're experts, not just on politics, but in making politics make sense. Every episode, we decode everything that happened in Washington and help you figure out what it all means. Give politics a chance with the NPR Politics Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, YouTube fam, if you want to support the Bulwark, the best way to do it is by becoming a YouTube Bulwark Plus member. The Bulwark is truly independent. We have no corporate overlords. We're not settling any dumb lawsuits with Trump. By joining, you help support our work, and you can get a bunch of perks right here on this platform. Ad-free content, bonus videos, live streams, and some emojis of me, which I guess some people want. So come join, come hang out, become a Bulwark YouTube Plus member, and I'll be seeing you in the comments. So behave. Tulsi monkeying around with the intel. We knew a new report from the New York Times this morning. Emails documenting how Joe Kent, it's just so absurd that Joe Kent has such a prime role in intelligence gathering in our government. I once wrote an article where I monitored him get interviewed by like an 18-year-old white nationalist who was doing the interview from his dorm room, and Joe Kent was like apologizing to him for, just saying something that was offensive to Nick Fuentes or whatever. Like it was a deeply humiliating situation. I don't know if Joe Kent is a white nationalist, but he sure was happy to suck up to a teenage white nationalist to help get elected. He lost. Anyway, he's Tulsi's deputy now. This is the right-hand man. And I guess he sent an email to the experts at the DNI that said, we need to do some rewriting of this memo regarding Venezuela's ties to Nicaragua. Quote, so this document is not used against the DNI or POTUS. As it turns out, there were a couple of honorable people in the intelligence community, Michael Collins, chair of the NIC, and his deputy, Maria Langen-Rakoff, who put out an accurate intel assessment. They were then fired. Pretty alarming stuff. I don't know what you make of what's happening with Tulsi at the DNI.
Yeah, I mean, the National Intelligence Council is the main, kind of analytic coordinating body for the U.S. Intelligence community, and its assessments are very important. And to be subjected to such a sort of almost embarrassingly transparent form of political manipulation, right? There's a big scandal when they're like, kind of implicit winks and nods and, can't you just give me the raw intelligence kind of stuff in previous Republican administrations that we all remember. And yet here they are. These folks don't even bother to hide the corruption, right? And it is corruption. It is actually corrupt to say that we want our intelligence council, and I'm going to put it in writing, by the way, that we want our intelligence council to tell us that the United States is under invasion by a Venezuelan gang operating at the behest of the Venezuelan state. No part of that sentence is accurate. And why do they want that? So that they can justify the deportation of thousands of people under the Alien Enemies Act, an obscure 18th century law that has never essentially been used for this purpose. Obviously, this is still winding its way through the courts, but the underlying premise here is a fiction. And that's what this controversy underscores, which is that it relies upon the kind of Stephen Miller theory of the case, which is don't believe your own lying eyes. America is under invasion by a bunch of gangsters from Venezuela. Spoiler alert, America is not being invaded here, people. Okay. So if your entire legal case rests on the idea that America is being invaded, then you are asking lots of people in the federal government to lie. And I think this example really resonated for me because it just shows, kind of that fiction, but it also shows the lengths to which these folks are willing to go, and also that they're not very bright. Like, let's go ahead and put in writing that, please, would you rewrite this to say what I wanted to say? Because this is not helpful to me politically here. I would
like to dial in just really quick on the not very bright part, because on the heels of the Signal controversy, where the Secretary of Defense is putting his wife and his brother on Signal, talking about war plans, and accidentally putting on Jeffrey Goldberg on Signal to discuss war plans, we have the key man at the DNI putting in an email that he wants people to falsify intelligence records. I mean, did this guy not watch The Wire? Like, we're taking notes on a criminal conspiracy. Could he not have picked up the phone? I don't want them. I'm happy that they created a trail of their corruption, but it's pretty concerning. You would think that the people at the top of the intelligence agencies would be a little bit more careful. But I mean, it feels like it's a clown show across the board here.
I think if Donald Trump wanted somebody at the head of the intelligence agencies who would have been a little bit more careful, then he wouldn't have chosen Tulsi Gabbard to be the director of national intelligence.
Hard to argue with that. Other related stuff regarding the Alien Enemies Act. Kristi Noem was testifying in front of Congress yesterday. I'm sure you've seen it already, but we deserve to listen to it one more time.
So, Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right to.
Let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President
habeas
Lincoln
corpus,
used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people.
I love Senator Maggie Hassan there. Excuse me, that's incorrect, actually.
Well, I have to say, she didn't laugh. I mean, that's not easy to do. That's where you got to props to the politicians for, putting their game face on. I mean, it's not something I could do. You listen to that and you're like, what the hell are you talking about, woman?
What she's talking about, she just doesn't know. I just think what that reveals is that she's been hearing all this discussion about habeas corpus, this word that she's heard, and she heard it in the context of Stephen Miller saying that we can use this thing in order to illegally kidnap more people. And so she processed it in her brain as oh, that must be kind of the Latin tool that we can use if we want to go around the law. That's the only plausible explanation for it. Or else, I don't know, maybe the botulism got kind of leaked in. That's also possible. I don't know. Any other theories? Guys, it's not. We're not at the top of our game here between Joe Kent and Kristi Noem. The serious side of this, the non-humorous side, there's the Cato analysis that came out of the Venezuelans. And we've learned that you might remember the CBS put out a list of like, I forget if it was 240 or 260 Venezuelans that we'd sent to Socote in El Salvador. It turns out that wasn't a comprehensive list. There's actually more people that have not been named yet. But Cato is going through the list, and there's a big group of the people that it's like hard to find what their process was. It's hard to track them down. But they were able to identify some percentage of that 250 some odd Venezuelans. And they found that 50 of them came here legally, never violated any immigration law, never violated any law in America. That doesn't mean, who knows, like maybe some subset of that 50 were gang members in Venezuela. I don't know. But they came here legally either through the refugee process where there's vetting or through the CBP1 app where they, set up a meeting, and came to a port of entry at the border and, waited for, their judicial review. So that's like 50 people that did not break any laws that we kidnapped and sent to El Salvador. I mean, it is truly, it is a scandal that is like beyond kind of what even like the kind of the worst Bush administration excesses, even though there were some bad ones, of course.
Yeah, I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around what a gross violation of everything the United States in theory stands for this would be. And I've been thinking about this because it's not just, we tend to focus here, and I understand why, but we tend to focus on the lack of due process in the process by which these people end up on a plane and end up being sent to El Salvador. That's one aspect of it that's horrifying. But in a big picture sense, even more horrifying is that they have been sent there in an open-ended way to rot in a prison in a foreign country that is not even in their own home, with no process, no ability to ever get out as far as we're aware. And they're just, they're going to spend the rest of their life rotting away in some prison in El Salvador with no terms. Like the worst criminals in the world, have not only the right of due process, but the right to a fair and speedy trial, to a sentence, whatever that sentence is. At least you would then know it, that you've been cast judgment by a legitimate court. None of these things have taken place. So those 50 people that you just mentioned in the Cato study, and there are very likely more, what's going to happen to them? They're going to just spend their entire life in prison in a sort of Orwellian example of being condemned for life for an offense that they are never told what it is, with no possibility of appeal in a foreign land that is not their own. It's really one of the worst things that I've heard the United States do, and so contrary to every aspect of our founding.
No, it would literally be like a criminal, a gang or whatever. Speaking of gang, like we're the gangs in this situation. It'd be like a gang kidnapping somebody out of a car and then throwing them into a hole, at the bottom of their compound. And then the person has to sit there and rot and wait and hope that cooler heads will prevail or something. I like, there's no, as you said, like even the worst criminals, they get a phone call, they get a visitation. Their mother knows where they are. The other thing the Cato analysis said was that, I don't have it in front of me, but some percentage of these guys obviously have children. It's like their children can see them, can write them letters. There's a David Noriega did a story about a man, I don't get his name right, Widmer Sanguino. David Noriega did this segment for NBC News. I'll put a link in the show notes if people want to watch it. And it's like, this guy came again legally, like with his family. They had a CBP1 app. They had a meeting. He was there with his mother and with a brother, and he is the only one that gets pulled aside because I guess of the tattoos. And then he's disappeared. And David's interviewing this mother, and it's like, and it's crazy. It's crazy. It's like, they now are free, like living in America, waiting, going through the process, doing what people do. And it's like her son and the guy's brother is just gone. And it's sickening. Anyway, I don't know what more there's to say about that. We're also doing, there's another news story. I guess we're sending people to Libya and South Sudan now as well. Immigrants. One other thing I wanted to pick your brain on, I saw you did a post about an article, a tweet or whatever about PEPFAR. Back to our friend Marco, who said that I guess he's trying to claim that it's been that like 85% of PEPFAR has been maintained or whatever. I know you've covered a lot of sort of the stuff in this world. Elon is also trying to backtrack on this. He was at the Qatari Economic Forum trying to claim that it wasn't true, that they cut all the aid. Just wondering if you have any kind of thoughts or reporting or heard anything about what's happening in the kind of foreign aid space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of the biggest own goals in world politics I've ever seen, which is Rubio going along with Elon Musk and others who came in at the beginning of this second Trump administration and basically destroyed in a very short amount of time America's soft power in the world, shutting down our efforts to broadcast truthful, independent information to people in Asia, for example, shutting down refugee programs that benefit people, childhood nutrition programs around the world in Africa as well as in Asia. Basically saying we're not going to do anything positive. And so the only thing that's left for America as far as projection of itself and its image in the world are stories like the stories we were just talking about, sending people off to rot in prison with no due process. You mentioned, kleptocracy also, taking a free plane from the government of Qatar for our president's personal use. But I think that when the story of this all is written, the shutting down unilaterally with no process of programs approved by Congress, authorized and funded by Congress, by Marco Rubio himself, who not only voted for these programs as a senator, but was a chief proponent of many of them. He was a board member of the International Republican Institute until the minute he was sworn in as the Secretary of State. What have we done? We've shut down all of America's election monitoring missions around the world. And I can tell you, those things matter to people who are fighting for freedom and democracy around the world. Those things really matter. And does the theory of the case now that Donald Trump has, and I don't think that most Americans really understand this. Donald Trump believes it doesn't matter that the United States can partner with the world's worst tyrants, strongmen, and killers, and that's just fine. And maybe we're just like them in the end. And I think that that's a very, very dubious proposition for how this country can go forward in the world. But that's what's happened with all of this. And to have Rubio then under oath, I noticed that many of his former Democratic colleagues were very chagrined in this hearing yesterday. They voted 99-0 to confirm Marco Rubio, the U.S. Senate did, because many Democrats, as well as many establishment Republicans, felt that he was the best possible secretary they could get under these circumstances. And I call your attention to a really painful back and forth between Rubio and Chris Van Hollen, the Democratic senator from Maryland, who told him to his face, well, I regret my vote for you. You're not who you said you were for all these years. And Rubio kind of quickly retorted back, well, if you regret it, then I guess that means it's confirmation I'm doing a good job.
Ugh. So it's like, just because you mentioned it, I should just, there are all these like minor corruptions that happen that happen outside of view, because we focus on the big ones. But IRI, the International Republican Institute, is one of those. Like, this was a pure, the more Republican-oriented internationalist organization that was about spreading democracy abroad, election monitors. John McCain was a big proponent of it, and it's another one of those things. I know at least one person who was pushed out of there for their commentary criticizing Trump on all of this, because it's like any other one of these little institutions wants to stay in the good graces of Trump, even though he's anathema to what the whole point of the institution is. So, all right, last thing, any other Hill thoughts? You mentioned the confirmation hearing. I guess I haven't noted on the pod, Jared Kushner's dad. So we're going with Nepo Grampy as the term for Charles Kushner. And he got confirmed for ambassador to France. Cory Booker voted for that, which I thought I haven't heard a good answer on why that is. But that's happening. Obviously, over on the next level, I'm going to talk about what's happening with the reconciliation bill. But any other thoughts before I lose you on what's been happening over on the Hill?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line is that Democrats haven't really gotten their act together. They have not yet figured out a way to use any of their remaining levers of power, which are minimal, to affect any kind of constraint on Donald Trump. There's not even a whimper, it seems to me, of a sign yet that Republicans, even those who oppose some of what Trump's doing, are willing to stand up for the institutional prerogatives of Congress. They're basically still, seems to me, waiting for the courts to do what Congress itself has refused to do, which is to say, wait, only we have the power under our Constitution to determine how America's taxpayer dollars are spent. And, until Congress wakes up, we are a government that's out of control, in my view. We're a government that's not functioning the way our Constitution envisioned it. But I don't think anybody should be expecting Republicans on Capitol Hill to wake up anytime soon.
Me neither. Another uplifting episode of the Bulwark Podcast with Susan Glasser. Thank you so much. My love to Theo and the fam, and we'll be talking to you again soon.
So great to be with you, Tim. Thank you. Sorry for the depressing note.
Nah, hey, it comes with the territory. Everybody else, we'll be back here tomorrow with another edition. We'll see you all then. Peace. Hey guys, it's Tim and Sarah. We're here with my frenemy, John Lovett from Love It or Leave It. June is Pride Month, and we're going to be live in D.C. on June 6th for World Pride for a very special live show fundraiser featuring the three of us, plus some gay special guests.
Crooked and the Bulwark will be donating the proceeds from this fundraiser to the Immigrant Defenders Law Center to support Andre Romero, the makeup artist who the Trump administration wrongly disappeared to El Salvador and who is currently being held in Sakat.
Go to crooked.com/events.
And we will see you all on June 6th.